A tawny shape lay half-submerged in the dark water, the reeds parting just enough to show the slow blink of amber eyes. The first ranger saw the drag marks before he saw her, two broad sweeps through trampled sedge rimmed with churned mud that shone like oil in the weak morning light. They moved quietly along the bank, counting each step as if sound alone might press the trapped lioness deeper, and soon the ground changed underfoot. Not soil, but skin like mud, elastic, sucking, marked by the smears of a heavy body. Her chest rose in shallow gathers, then paused. Bubbles threaded out from her whiskers and burst soft against the water's skin. One ear twitched and stilled. A mailed fly crept over the fine scar on her muzzle and lifted away as her nostrils flared once, tasting them. They took longer breaths on purpose, letting calm seep through their shoulders before they went closer. One tested the bank with a pole, noting where the dark turned to deeper black and where a hidden root revealed a firmer step. Another traced the pattern of her struggle, the slide from the clay rim, the attempt to turn, the hollow where her hindquarters had sunk and locked. Her tail had left a light line over the sedge, then a broken arc, then nothing. She was not old, but her hips were sharp from the last lean season and her ribs lifted high with each thin breath. When she tried to free herself, the mud held fast as if it had memory. They spoke without raising their voices, measuring their words around the lioness's slow strength. One pointed out the slight current. It pulled toward a silted channel under the reeds, deceptively still at the surface, a cold hand beneath. Another scanned the grass edge for tracks of other lions, reading scat and sun-bleached hairs caught on stems. The signs were old. She had been alone when she slipped. Her eyes followed them without white, golden, and heavy, and the muscles along her neck wavered like a rope under strain. She did not growl. She conserved. They set down the pack with a soft thud and laid out what mattered first: a blanket to shade her face if she thrashed, a coil of rope padded with torn t-shirt, a half-empty water bottle, two short planks scabbed with dried mud from other days. One ranger slid a foot forward and watched it sink, counted, then withdrew. He nodded at a path of roots, a narrow stitch that might hold a careful weight. A heron stepped away upstream, the click of its bill faint as a pin. Frogs fell silent. The lioness shifted her forepaws, and all three froze as the mud sighed and swallowed another finger's width of her flank. Her breathing shortened. She lifted her chin a fraction and let it fall. When a mosquito lit on her lower lid, the twitch that drove it off seemed to cost her. They spoke to her then, not as a pet but as a presence they wanted to steady. Voices worn smooth by the field. "Easy, girl. We see you." The line passed over the water like a hand smoothing a sheet. She blinked again, slower. A droplet gathered on a whisker and broke. One ranger wetted a cloth and wrung it, counting the drip until it slowed, and tucked the bottle back where it would not reflect. They worked the plan the way they always did, piece by piece with more pauses than movement. One would test, another would watch the lioness for the half-signs that meant pain or fear, the flex of toes, the press of pads, the long swallow. They would not rush. The goal, for now, was not to move her, but to map the mud, to know which inches could bear a heel and which would turn to swallowing silt. A breeze came thin from the ridge and shifted the reed heads, laying brief stripes of light across her back. Under the water, trapped bubbles slid from her fur like silver grains. Minutes lengthened, and with them a quiet agreement formed between living beings that did not need names. When the lioness heard the soft shuffle of a boot, she did not flinch. When the rangers moved closer, they showed their hands low and empty and kept their gaze a little to the side. The mud cooled around her as the sun lifted, and once, very slightly, her tail tip stirred and settled again. They would try a loop soon, but first they waited for her breath to even, for the small tremor in her shoulder to pass. The swamp held its own slow heart, and in that pulse the rescue began, not with a pull, but with stillness shared. The ropes came out slowly, unfurled by steady hands that knew silence was part of the rescue. The swamp's breath rose in small circles on the surface, the smell of damp roots clinging to every move. One ranger tested a plank, laying it across the worst of the mire until it held, then leaned his weight forward an inch at a time. Another kept the coil of rope lifted high to keep it from soaking. They moved in brief surges, always waiting for the lioness's shallow breathing to steady before the next step. Her ribs lifted, then fell, the mud clinging tighter around her body as if reluctant to let go. The first rope was padded with a torn strip of cloth. A ranger crouched low, sliding it beneath her chest, careful not to dig against the fur matted with water. The lioness stirred at the touch, ears tipping back, but she did not strike. The mud pinned her too firmly, and her strength seemed poured into each labored breath. Another rope was eased beneath her hips, the swamp sighing as it released tiny bubbles that popped with a faint hiss. The sound was brief, but it sent small ripples through her flanks. She groaned once, a deep vibration that ended in silence. The blanket came next, laid gently across her head to dim the glare of light and the sight of figures moving at her side. A ranger kept a hand on it, not restraining but steadying. His touch meant only to remind her of calm. Her whiskers brushed the cloth as she breathed, and when she coughed, a spray of mud flecked the edge of the fabric. Her tail lifted slightly, fell again, and lay still. The rope ends were anchored to a thick root at the bank, its surface gnarled and slick but firm enough to bear the strain. One ranger wrapped it twice and braced his boots, testing the line with a slow pull. Another adjusted the plank beneath her shoulder, easing it deeper so her body would not scrape. They did not rush. Between each motion they waited for the rise and fall of her ribs, measuring her state against the tempo of their work. A dragonfly skimmed low, wings flashing, and the stillness deepened around them. When the first pull began, the lioness gave a heavy exhale, her chest rising higher as if air could now travel deeper. Mud released with a wet gasp, loosening around her flank. She groaned again, softer this time, the sound fading into a hiss of bubbles. A ranger whispered, the words barely above breath. "Hold and breathe." It was meant for both sides, for the lioness to steady, for the men to remain measured. The line drew tight, and slowly her body shifted forward by the width of a paw. They paused, waiting. Her ears flicked, her nostrils opened wider, drawing in fresher air now touched with grass. Then came the second pull, guided by hands that leaned together, never jerking, only a weight shared against the ropes. Her hips rose free, her back sliding along the plank, mud shearing away in sheets. She coughed again, spattering the reeds with dark water, and her eyes opened wider beneath the blanket, catching a sliver of light. With one final effort, the last of her ribs cleared the grip of the swamp. The ropes slackened as she rolled slightly onto firmer earth, her chest heaving with ragged but fuller breaths. She did not attempt to strike or flee. Instead, she lay where they had drawn her, sides shuddering, ears still pressed back but body no longer sinking. The mud settled with a sluggish ripple, as if conceding. One ranger kept the blanket lightly in place until her panting eased, then withdrew it, folding it back with slow hands. Her eyes followed the motion, heavy but aware. The swamp behind her was quiet now, its grip broken. Ahead, on solid ground, her future breaths began to lengthen into steadier rhythm. A shelter of shade was built in patient silence. A square of tarp stretched between branches to break the weight of the sun. The lioness lay just beneath it, sides heaving, fur crusted with dried mud and dark streaks of water. A ranger filled a sponge and let the drops fall one by one onto her tongue, watching each trickle vanish between her parted jaws. She did not resist, only flicked her ears once in faint acknowledgement, then stilled again. Her breath still rasped, but its rhythm had deepened, carrying more air than it had inside the swamp. Minutes passed like hours. marked only by the slow return of strength. Her flanks settled more evenly, the rise and fall less frantic. The cords of muscle along her neck loosened, and her tail twitched once, as though remembering the movement. The rangers did not move closer. They kept their distance, speaking softly only to one another, words muffled by the breeze. The lioness shifted her weight slightly, claws pressing into the earth, as if testing whether the ground would hold her this time. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them wide, staring ahead into reeds that swayed and whispered. The smell of damp mud still clung to her, yet the air was fresher now, tinged with grass. She drew it deep into her lungs. A longer breath than she had managed since the first sighting. With effort, she tucked her forelegs beneath her chest, pressing her shoulders forward until they bore part of her weight. Her body trembled, but she did not fall. The earth gave her something solid the swamp had denied. A ranger leaned slightly forward, hands loose at his sides, eyes lowered. The others followed his lead, holding back the instinct to rush in. They knew the moment belonged to her alone. She rocked once, swayed, then drew her hind legs beneath her, joints shuddering as they locked against the strain. For a heartbeat she hovered there, suspended between collapse and standing. Then, in a slow surge, she rose. Her back arched, her head lifted. And she swayed upright, unsteady, but no longer trapped. The sight was met not with cheers, but with silence. The men stepped back in unison, each giving her room. She turned her head toward them, amber eyes half-shadowed, whiskers dripping with threads of water. A soft, breathy grunt left her throat. Not threat, not anger, only a low sound of presence. They answered it by lowering their eyes, shoulders softening, showing they would not press further. One voice carried across the reeds, hushed and steady. "We're here, but we'll stand back." The lioness blinked, slow and deliberate. Her body swayed, but her legs held, every muscle alive with trembling. She turned her face toward the wind, mane of reeds brushing against her side, as though anchoring her. Her tail lifted once, curled slightly, then lowered again. A small gesture, but one of balance regained. The sedges bent and whispered, leaves brushing against each other in a rhythm that matched her shallow exhale. She stood there, suspended in the quiet, until the tension eased from her stance. Her flanks still bore streaks of mud, her ribs still pressed sharply against skin, but strength had returned enough to root her. Behind her, the swamp lay still, only the faint ripple of disturbed water showing where she had been caught. Before her stretched a path of grass and firmer soil. She gave no sign of hurry, no sudden step, only the patience of an animal reclaiming her body moment by moment. The rangers stayed as they were, shadows at the edge of her recovery. None reached forward, none broke the silence. They watched her stand, trembling yet steady, until the wind carried the last trace of mud's heavy scent away. In its place came the smell of dry earth and sun-warmed reeds. It settled over the clearing like a benediction, and in that air she remained, upright, alive, claiming the ground once more. A tremor passed through her flanks, sharper than the quiver of weak muscles. It came again, more insistent, a ripple that tightened beneath her ribs before easing away. The rangers noticed it at once. Their breaths caught, though they said nothing. The lioness shifted her weight, lowering her head. Then rose and circled clumsily over the patch of ground she had claimed. The reeds leaned and rustled against her, brushing mud from her coat as she pressed through them. She searched the earth with the sweep of her paws until she found a stretch of drier grass, its color pale against the dark soil. There she paused, sides heaving, then lowered herself with a long groan. It deepened into panting, shallow bursts that fogged the air round her muzzle. The men exchanged glances, though no words followed. They knew the rhythm had changed. This was not the exhaustion of escape, not the trembling of spent strength. It was something older, heavier, beyond their reach. Slowly they withdrew, placing brush between themselves and the lioness. Each step deliberate so the sound of retreat would not disturb her. One knelt, lowering his gaze to the earth, and the others followed, folding into the hush of the clearing. They watched with stillness that mirrored her own waiting. Her breath came harder now, each contraction running through her frame like distant thunder. Her body stretched, then stilled, then surged again. She dug her claws into the soil for purchase, muzzle pressed low as a moan carried out into the reeds. Frogs silenced their calls. The heron had long since gone, and only the wind remained to move the grass in a slow wave around her. Her tail lifted, struck once against the ground, and lay flat again. The muscles along her back rippled with effort, then clenched. Time stretched, marked not by minutes but by the swell and fall of her sides. Saliva thickened at her lips as her panting quickened, each breath forcing warmth into the cooling air. Her eyes half closed, lashes rimmed with mud, then widened again when another surge overtook her. Beneath her tail, the first glisten of fluid showed. She shifted, rearranging her limbs with awkward jerks, and then froze as the next contraction bore down. The men kept their distance, unmoving, their silhouettes blurred against the dimming light. No one reached forward, no one spoke, until one ranger whispered what the others already knew. "Let her be." The words sank into the hush, and nothing else was said. With a final strain, her body arched. And the moment broke. Wet life slid onto the earth, dark and small, coated in the fluids of birth. The lioness turned at once, her muzzle finding the form with instinct sharpened by urgency. She licked, rough and fast, clearing the face, urging breath into lungs that had never before drawn air. For a heartbeat there was only silence. Then a thin, wavering mewl rose into the evening. The sound was fragile yet piercing, floating above the reeds and falling back again like rain on grass. The mother did not pause. She licked and nudged, coaxing the tiny body toward movement. Its limbs trembled weakly, paws spreading and curling as it sought the ground. Another plaintive cry followed, thinner than the first, but stronger in intent. The lioness grunted low in reply, pressing her muzzle along its flank, then covered it again in strokes that warmed and stirred it. She shifted her weight protectively, curling her body into an arc around the cub. The rangers remained as shadows on the fringe. Their eyes did not leave the scene, yet their hands rested slack against their knees, knowing their part was over. What had begun as a rescue was no longer theirs to guide. They bore witness only, caught between awe and stillness. As the sun dropped lower, painting the reeds in bronze light, the cub's mewling softened into faint rhythmic squeaks. The lioness bent her head, enclosing it beneath her chin, her breath warming the fragile body. She closed her eyes briefly, exhausted but unyielding, then opened them again to the quiet world. The rangers stayed hidden behind the brush. No word was spoken, no move was made. The only sound that mattered now was the fragile voice of new life carried across the swamp, turning what had been a struggle for survival into something far beyond what any of them had expected. The cub pressed its nose into the folds of her belly, searching with awkward insistence until it found what it needed. A faint, rhythmic suckling followed, small and uncertain at first, then steady. The lioness closed her eyes, her body sagging with release. A long exhale shuddered through her frame, carrying with it the exhaustion of hours spent trapped and the final strain of birth. Her flanks lifted and fell more slowly now, each breath deeper than the one before. Mud clung to her coat in cracked ridges, yet the curve of her body softened as stillness replaced struggle. The rangers stayed back, kneeling in the reeds, letting distance keep the moment hers. They did not move, not even when a low breeze tugged at the tarp they had left behind. In the hush, the tiny sounds of life carried clearly, the wet lapping of the cub's tongue, the faint grunt of the mother shifting her weight, the thump of her tail as it fell against dry grass. Above them, the sky paled toward evening, the light spreading gold over the marsh and catching the thin mist that rose off the water. Far off, a call drifted across the grasslands, long and resonant. Another answered, lower, more patient, the sound carrying like a drumbeat beneath the wind. The lioness lifted her head, ears pricking, nostrils widening as she tasted the air. The cub, still pressed against her, whimpered at the change in posture, but she bent her neck again and nudged it gently closer, coaxing it back to comfort. Her tongue passed once more over its back, smoothing what birth had left damp and raw. Minutes stretched, unbroken but for the far-off calls, repeating with steady rhythm. The rangers exchanged no words. They understood what drew her, and they knew the choice she would make. Her strength had not fully returned, yet something greater than exhaustion pulled her to rise. She leaned onto her forelegs, pressing her chest upward, the cub mewling as it tumbled briefly away. She caught it quickly, her jaws careful, teeth not piercing skin but holding firm. With a slow gathering of her hind legs, she stood. Her steps were unsteady at first. The reeds bent beneath her weight, releasing the smell of damp earth and sweet rot. She paused once, adjusting the cub's small body between her teeth, then moved forward again, each stride more certain than the last. The light softened over her, painting her mud-streaked coat with the last warmth of day. Every step carried her farther from the stillness of struggle and closer to the open plains where her kind called. The men stood only when she had turned her back to them. They gathered their planks, ropes, and empty bottles in silence, their boots sinking into mud that clung and tried to keep them. None spoke of what they had seen, not yet. One ranger's voice finally broke the hush, low and steady, carried more to the wind than to anyone beside him. "Thank you. Go home." The words faded into the reeds as the lioness slipped deeper into the grass. Her path was marked only by the brief parting of stems, closing again behind her with each step. The cub dangled gently from her jaws, its small paws twitching, its eyes sealed tight against the fading light. Ahead, the distant calls waited, steady and patient, guiding her forward. Behind, the swamp lay quiet, its surface smooth once more, as if nothing had happened. The rangers reached the edge of firmer soil, their boots heavy with mud, their chests heavy with something they would not put into words. They watched only until the last ripple of reeds closed around her. Then they turned back toward their path, carrying away the tools of their trade and a memory that would linger long after the mud had dried. The evening wind stirred, brushing through the grass in low waves. The light fell softer still, until the earth was gilded in the hush of approaching night. Somewhere within that vastness, a lioness carried her cub home, leaving footprints in the grass that the breeze soon erased. The reeds swayed long after she passed, their slow dance marking the trail of her body as though reluctant to release her presence. The cub shifted in her jaws, uttering a faint squeak, muffled but determined, and the lioness adjusted her hold without breaking stride. Each step carried her farther into the fading light, her silhouette narrowing as the grasses closed around her flanks. Behind her, silence deepened, the swamp holding its breath, as if aware that what had unfolded there would never be repeated in quite the same way. The rangers stood together in a loose line, not speaking, their eyes following until sight gave way to imagination. None needed to name the moment. It lived wordless, etched in how their shoulders fell and how their boots pressed heavier into the mud. One bent to gather the last board, brushing reeds from its surface before lifting it onto his shoulder. Another coiled the rope, mud darkening its fibers, careful with the task as though it had become a relic of something sacred. They worked as men do when silence is part of the duty, each motion slow, deliberate, filled with the understanding that noise would be an intrusion. The sky spread wider as the sun tilted low, spilling gold and then orange into the marshland. Long shadows stretched across the water, mirroring the tall reeds in wavering lines. Dragonflies hovered, their wings catching the last scraps of light, before settling onto stems that leaned beneath their weight. A frog croaked once, then another answered, and life seeped back into the swamp, cautious but unbroken. Even the air smelled different now, not only of mud and stagnant water, but of warm earth and the faint musk of new life carried on the breeze. Far ahead, the lioness paused in a patch of thinning reeds. She lowered the cub briefly to the ground, circling it once with her body before lying down beside it. She licked along its spine, urging it upright again, and the cub tried to clamber onto its small legs, stumbling before collapsing into her side. The mother did not push harder. She waited, patient in a way only wild instinct teaches. She bent her head, muzzle pressing into the cub's tiny flank, and exhaled, the sound more sigh than growl. In the glow of evening, their shapes blurred together, large and small, strength and fragility woven into one. The rangers watched until the view was gone, the tall grass folding behind her like a curtain. They turned finally, walking in quiet file toward their vehicle, their boots leaving deep prints that would soon be filled by water. Each carried not only the weight of mud on their soles, but the unshakable imprint of what they had seen. A rescue that had become a birth, a survival that had turned to renewal. Wind carried the distant calls again, closer this time, low and steady. It was not their world to follow, only to hear. The men paused once more at the ridge, glancing back at the reeds where movement had vanished. The place looked ordinary again. No trace of the struggle, no mark of the miracle, only the soft evening light gilding the marsh. They shouldered their tools and began the walk home. The sun slipped lower, and with it came a peace that belonged to the land itself. In the grasslands beyond, a lioness moved steadily with her cub, leaving prints that would fade by dawn, but whose meaning would remain forever with those who had witnessed them.